Jerusalem, Friday morning, the day before a major feast. Just outside the city wall, along the road leading in through the northern gate, there's a low outcrop of limestone the city has used for the same purpose for decades, so that it can be seen from the road. It's hot. The air smells like dust, sweat, and iron. At the base of the rock, a handful of bored soldiers are gambling for a piece of clothing. Above them, 3 men hang from 3 wooden beams, barely more than a few feet off the ground. The one in the middle is breathing badly. He's been up there less than 6 hours. And that's the first anomaly in this case, because Roman crucifixion wasn't a fast method of execution. It was a method deliberately engineered to take time. Some condemned men lasted 2 days. 3, a handful, lasted 4. This man is going to die by that same afternoon. And when the governor hears the news, he isn't going to believe it. Case file 002. Subject, male, approximately 30 to 35 years old, laborer's build, no documented prior pathology. Location, Golgotha, just outside the walls of Jerusalem, Roman province of Judea. Approximate date, a Friday during Passover, somewhere between the years 30 and 33 of the Common Era. Official cause, execution by crucifixion, ordered by the prefect Pontius Pilate. Case status, the precise mechanism of death still debated in medical literature today. The name is written on a sign nailed above his head in 3 languages. Jesus of Nazareth. I want to be completely clear before we start, because everything that follows depends on it. What this man was and what he continues to be for billions of people today doesn't get decided on an autopsy table. We're not touching that question here. Not because it doesn't matter, because it matters too much to be decided by this kind of analysis. What we are going to do is exactly what any forensic team would do standing in front of a body. Reconstruct the final 18 hours. Catalog every injury in the order it occurred. Calculate what each one actually did to that organism. And determine, with as much precision as the evidence allows, what specifically stopped that heart. We have 4 eyewitness accounts. We have Roman medical and military texts describing the procedure in detail. We have exactly 2 skeletons in the entire archaeological record showing physical evidence of it, and we have 150 years of medical literature arguing about the answer. Let's open the file. We reconstruct the timeline from the 4 accounts, and the first thing any investigator notices is that all 4 agree on the general sequence of events and disagree on the exact hours. In criminology, that's not a red flag. It's the expected pattern. 4 witnesses who agree on absolutely everything usually means coordination. 4 who agree on the skeleton of events and differ on the clock usually means independence. Thursday, after nightfall. A meal shared among a small group. Afterward, a wooded area east of the city, across a seasonal valley. The subject spends several hours awake, in a state one of the 4 accounts describes as extreme anguish. That same account, and only that one, adds a striking clinical detail. Sweat falling to the ground like drops of blood. It's worth being honest about this one. There's a documented phenomenon in modern medical literature, hematohydrosis, in which ruptured capillaries around the sweat glands under extreme stress can tint perspiration with blood. A few hundred cases have been described worldwide. It's exceptionally rare, and that specific detail doesn't appear in some of the oldest surviving manuscripts of the account, which is exactly why scholars debate whether it was part of the original text. We can't lean on it as solid evidence. We note it in the margin, the way any serious report handles a questionable data point. Arrest overnight. No recorded resistance. From this point forward, the subject doesn't sleep again. Early morning, first interrogation before religious authorities. The account's record blows to the face, spitting, and a blindfold used while striking him. Translated into clinical language, closed facial trauma, probable periorbital swelling, possible nasal fracture, mucosal bleeding. Daybreak. Transfer to the Roman prefect. Second interrogation. Sent to a third authority. Sent back to the prefect. By this point, he's gone roughly 12 hours without sleep, food, or water, marched on foot between distant points in the city, surrounded by a shouting crowd the entire time. Mid-morning, the order that changes everything, flogging. This is worth stopping on because Roman flogging doesn't look anything like what most films show. Jewish law capped lashes at 39. Roman law applied to someone who wasn't a Roman citizen capped nothing. The instrument was the flagrum, a short wooden handle with several leather straps extending from it and tied at intervals along each strap, fragments of bone or small lead balls. The lead balls caused deep bruising. The bone fragments cut. The condemned man was bound to a low post, bent forward, back fully exposed, with two men alternating strikes from either side. Roman writers describing this procedure, and they weren't exactly squeamish people, used the word horrific. Eusebius, writing centuries later, describes exposed veins and torn open muscle. A body coming out of a severe Roman flogging typically has the back, buttocks, and back of the thighs reduced to shredded tissue. After that came the mockery, a robe, a reed placed in his hand, and a crown woven from thorny branches pressed onto his head. The scalp is one of the most heavily vascularized regions of the human body. A wound there bleeds dramatically out of proportion to the actual damage it causes. Then the walk to the execution site. The condemned man didn't carry the full cross. That would have weighed anywhere from 100 to several hundred pounds depending on the design. He carried the patibulum, the horizontal crossbeam alone, somewhere between 60 and 100 pounds, laid across the back of the neck and shoulders, arms tied over the top of it, across a back that had just been flogged raw. And here's the second important forensic detail. He doesn't make it. The accounts record the soldiers grabbing a man passing by, someone named Simon, in from the countryside, from the city of Cyrene, and forcing him to carry the beam instead. Roman soldiers didn't do this out of compassion. They did it when the condemned man could no longer walk under his own power, and there was a real risk he'd die before the execution could actually take place, which for the executioner counted as a failure. Sit with Simon for a second, a stranger, in from the countryside, probably heading into Jerusalem for the feast, and his whole morning gets violently rerouted. He leaves his house with an ordinary plan and ends up carrying a torture instrument for a condemned man he's never met. The accounts remember his name and the names of his two sons. Someone, decades later, still knew exactly who that man was. Around midday, he's offered wine mixed with myrrh, a rough analgesic of the period. He refuses it. They nail him. They raise the beam. Above his head, they hang the sign listing the charge against him. Roughly 3 hours later, a loud cry, and breathing stops. Toward evening, soldiers break the legs of the two men crucified alongside him. They don't break his, because they confirm he's already dead. One of them drives a spear into his side instead. From the wound, according to the account, comes blood, and something that looked like water. End of the reconstruction. Now, the physical evidence. For almost 2,000 years, crucifixion was a procedure we had thousands of written pages about and exactly 0 bodies for. The Romans crucified tens of thousands of people, and not a single skeleton existed to prove it. There's a grim reason for that. Someone crucified typically wasn't buried afterward. The body stayed on the beam until animals and decomposition finished the job. That was part of the punishment itself. That this particular man was taken down, wrapped, and placed in a carved tomb was, by Roman standards, a genuine exception. That changed in 1968 at Givat ha-Mivtar, north of Jerusalem. Construction work uncovered a first-century family tomb containing several ossuaries. Inside one, inscribed with a name, Yehohanan, son of Hagkol, was a heel bone with an iron nail, roughly 4.5 inches long, still driven through it. The nail couldn't be removed because its tip had bent on impact with a knot in the wood. Between the nail's head and the bone, a small fragment of olive wood remained, a washer of sorts that had kept the foot from tearing free. The entry angle, through the side of the heel, suggests the legs were positioned on either side of the upright beam rather than nailed straight through the front. Yehohanan was somewhere between 24 and 28 years old. For 50 years, that was the only confirmed case anywhere in the world. Then, in 2017, in Fenstanton, England, archaeologists found the skeleton of a Roman-era male with a nail still driven through the heel bone. It was published in 2021. 2 bodies on the entire planet across 20 centuries. Second piece of evidence, the prefect actually existed. In 1961, excavations at the theater in Caesarea Maritima uncovered a limestone block that had been reused as a step. The inscription, fragmentary but legible, names Pontius Pilate as the official responsible for Judea. Before that discovery, some historians genuinely questioned whether he existed outside of religious texts. Third piece, the procedure is described in detail by the people who actually carried it out. Cicero calls it the most cruel and disgusting punishment. Seneca describes bodies deformed and swollen, nailed in different configurations depending on the executioner's mood. And Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, calls it the most wretched of deaths and provides a detail that's going to matter a great deal later on. He personally saw 3 acquaintances of his crucified petition Titus for clemency, had them taken down alive, and handed them over to physicians. 2 died anyway. 1 survived. Fourth piece, the physical design. Nothing like the towering crosses in religious art. The typical height left the condemned man's feet less than 3 feet off the ground, within reach of scavenging animals, and at eye level for anyone walking past on the road. That was the entire point. Some beams included a sedile, a small wooden seat that supported part of the body's weight. This wasn't mercy. It was engineering specifically designed to stretch out the suffering. Fifth piece, where the nails actually went. The palm of the hand has no bone structure capable of supporting the weight of an adult body. A nail through it would tear straight through the tissue between the fingers within minutes. French anatomist Pierre Barbet demonstrated in the 1930s that the nail had to go through the wrist instead, through what's called the space of Destot, between the carpal bones, where the bone can actually bear the load and no major artery runs through. Decades later, American forensic pathologist Frederick Zugebe challenged that conclusion with his own experiments, arguing that at a sufficiently oblique angle, the palm actually can support the weight. That debate is still open, but both researchers agree on the part that matters most here. Along either path, the nail runs directly alongside the median nerve. It doesn't sever it cleanly. It compresses and tears it. Damage to the median nerve produces a specific kind of pain, causalgic pain, described as burning, continuous, and unrelieved by rest, and every movement of the body against the nails would have reignited it completely. Now, the analysis? Let's total up the accumulated damage at the exact moment that body is raised onto the beam. Hydration status: somewhere between 18 and 20 hours without fluid intake, combined with heavy sweating, multiple bleeding sites, and severe physical exertion. Marked dehydration. Blood volume. This is the central factor in the entire case. The flogging alone doesn't kill, but it produces diffuse, ongoing blood loss across an enormous surface area of the body. Add scalp bleeding, facial trauma, and 4 separate nail wounds. The resulting clinical picture is consistent with hypovolemic shock, rapid pulse, low blood pressure, pallor, intense thirst, declining organ perfusion, eventual collapse. And the account records this man speaking exactly 2 words from the beam. I thirst. That's precisely what a patient in advanced hypovolemia would say. But it's also, and both things are true at once, one of the most simply human lines ever recorded. He didn't ask to be taken down. He asked for water, respiratory function. This is the mechanism that made crucifixion medically famous. With the arms extended and the body suspended, the rib cage gets locked into a position of inhalation. Pulling air in stays relatively possible. Pushing air out becomes active, deliberate work. To exhale fully, the crucified man has to push upward against the nails in his feet and pull with his wrists to lift the chest enough to release the breath. Every complete breath costs a fresh episode of maximum pain. The condemned man pushes up to breathe, then collapses because he can't sustain it. Up, breathe, collapse for hours. Once the muscles give out entirely, the cycle breaks down. Ventilation becomes insufficient. Carbon dioxide builds up in the blood, acidosis sets in, and layered on top of a heart already strained by hypovolemia and sustained adrenaline release, the risk of a fatal arrhythmia rises sharply. And the detail that confirms this exact mechanism isn't medical at all. It's legal. The Romans had a standard procedure for speeding up death whenever it suited them. Crucifixion, breaking the legs with an iron mallet. And it worked reliably. The forensic question is why it worked so reliably. It only makes sense if the condemned man's survival depended on using his legs to keep pushing upward. Break the legs, and the ability to push up for exhalation disappears entirely. Effective breathing stops. Death follows within minutes. That detail, recorded by a witness who had absolutely no concept of respiratory physiology, turns out to be the single strongest piece of indirect evidence in the entire file. Now, the 3 anomalies in this case. Anomaly 1, the speed. This man dies somewhere between 3 and 6 hours, depending on which account you use. That's abnormally fast for a crucifixion, and there's an unintentional witness who confirms exactly how unusual it was. The account from Mark records Pilate expressing surprise on hearing the man had already died and sending for the centurion to personally confirm it. A Roman prefect with years of executions behind him doesn't react with surprise for no reason. The strongest forensic explanation is that death wasn't primarily caused by the beam itself. It was caused by everything that happened before the beam. A man who arrives at the execution site already in advanced hypovolemic shock simply doesn't have the physiological reserves for the usual 2-day timeline. Anomaly 2. The cry. All 4 accounts agree he let out a loud exclamation immediately before dying. Clinically, that's strange. A patient dying from progressive respiratory exhaustion typically loses the ability to speak loudly long before the actual end. There simply isn't enough air left to produce a forceful cry. A loud, sudden vocalization suggests the final collapse was abrupt rather than gradual. Anomaly 3. Blood and water. The soldier's spear thrust wasn't random cruelty. It was standard Roman protocol for confirming death. What matters here is what the witness specifically describes coming out. 2 separate components, one of blood, one clear. There are several possible medical readings. 1. Pleural effusion or hemothorax, with fluid separation, consistent with severe prior chest trauma. 2. Pericardial effusion, fluid accumulation in the sac surrounding the heart. 3. If the spear entered the right side and angled upward, it may have passed through the lung and reached the right atrium, which in a corpse retains liquid blood. 4. The natural post-mortem separation of blood into clot and serum, something any modern medical examiner sees routinely, and something a first-century witness with no medical training would very plausibly describe in exactly those terms: blood and water. None of the 4 can be ruled out, and all 4 point in the same direction. By the time that spear went in, the subject was already dead. 150 years of medical literature, 3 leading hypotheses. Hypothesis A, asphyxiation from exhaustion. First formulated in the early 20th century and developed further by Pierre Barbet, this became the version that reached the general public. The crucified man dies because he eventually loses the ability to exhale. In favor, it explains the crura fragium, the posture, the progressive deterioration. Against it, Frederick Zugebe ran experiments in the 1980s and 90s with monitored volunteers suspended on crosses. With feet supported and arms at an open angle, none of them developed significant respiratory distress, even over extended periods. His conclusion was that asphyxiation alone can't be the primary mechanism. The obvious counter-argument: Zugibe's volunteers hadn't been flogged, dehydrated, sleep-deprived, or actually nailed. They were healthy. That's the honest limitation of any experiment attempted in this space. Hypothesis B, hypovolemic and traumatic shock. This is Zugibe's own position, and it's shared by a large share of current forensic medicine. Death arrives through circulatory collapse, blood loss, sustained extreme pain, exhaustion of the body's stress response, failing organ perfusion. In favor. It explains the speed, explains the collapse on the road to the execution site, explains the thirst, explains Pilate's prize. Against it, it explains less cleanly why breaking the legs so reliably accelerated death. Hypothesis C, acute cardiac event, a terminal arrhythmia, or possibly a cardiac rupture with tamponade. In favor, it's the only hypothesis that cleanly explains the loud cry immediately before death, and it fits neatly with the blood and clear fluid description. Against it, spontaneous rupture of the heart muscle in an otherwise healthy young man is a rare event. Possible, but rare. And current consensus, honestly, doesn't pick a single winner. Medical literature over the last 2 decades tends to describe death by crucifixion as a multifactorial process. Hypovolemia, dehydration, progressively insufficient ventilation, acidosis, sustained pain, and a final arrhythmia, in proportions that vary depending on the condition each individual arrived in. There's no single bullet here. There's an organism being pushed simultaneously down 5 different physiological paths toward the same endpoint. One more hypothesis remains, and it has to be addressed because it's existed since the 18th century. The idea that he never actually died, that he simply lost consciousness. Josephus proved surviving crucifixion was technically possible. One of his 3 acquaintances managed it. But Josephus's case also defines exactly what surviving required. They were taken down by imperial order ahead of schedule and handed immediately to physicians. And even then, 2 of the 3 died anyway. This case meets none of those conditions. The subject arrived at the cross already in shock, remained there until an experienced professional centurion officially confirmed death, received a verification spear thrust to the chest, and was wrapped and placed in a tomb with no medical assistance of any kind. From a strictly forensic standpoint, it's the weakest hypothesis on the table by a wide margin. We close the file with what the evidence supports and what it doesn't. It supports that the procedure existed exactly as the ancient texts describe it, and that we now have 2 skeletons on record proving it. It supports that this particular man arrived at the beam with prior damage severe enough that death within a few hours is medically coherent. It supports that he died before the spear thrust, and it supports that the mechanism was almost certainly a combination of circulatory collapse, progressive respiratory failure, and a final cardiac event. It doesn't support an exact percentage breakdown of responsibility between those factors. The precise immediate cause of this specific death, in that specific minute, remains genuinely debated among serious researchers, and it probably always will be. But there's one thing worth noting before this file closes. Everything we just reconstructed was completely invisible to the 4 men who originally wrote these accounts down. The flagrum, the median nerve, the mechanics of exhalation, hypovolemic shock, the post-mortem separation of serum and clot. None of that existed as knowledge in the 1st century. They weren't describing physiology. They were describing what they saw, that he collapsed on the road and they had to find someone else to carry the beam, that he said he was thirsty, that he cried out loudly right before he died, that something came out of his side that looked like blood and something that looked like water. 2,000 years later, every single one of those details turns out to be clinically coherent. That doesn't prove anyone's faith. Faith was never meant to be settled on an autopsy table, and anyone who has it doesn't actually need a medical examiner's signature on it. But it does prove something else, and it isn't small. Those witnesses weren't inventing a beautiful scene. They were doing their best, with the only words available to them to describe something they had genuinely watched happen. And there's one last detail no medical report can fully capture, because it doesn't fit in any box on the form. Every single breath during those hours cost a deliberate act of effort. To stay alive even 1 more minute, he had to push upward. He had to choose it, over and over again. Nobody dies slowly on a cross by accident. It happens slowly because, right up until the final minute, someone keeps choosing to take 1 more breath. Case file 002, cause of death, multifactorial, status, closed, with reservations. If you made it this far, drop a comment with which hypothesis you find most convincing, A, B, or C. And if you want to follow the next case file, subscribe to the channel. I'm closing this one